On today's show, how concerning is Alperen Sengun's start to this season? What about the Rockets' rebounding and consistency issues? We're going to tackle all that and so much more on today's Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member, also the host of Locked On NBA Thursdays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets, where the best way you can help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing. Like and subscribe on YouTube, and while you're there, drop us a comment, do a drive-by, just say Go Rockets. It helps us out a ton. Now, today's episode is sponsored by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off of your first purchase. And as always, thank you so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you so much for being an everydayer. Joining us now is your weekly co-host, none other than the podfather himself, Rockets Wire editor and host of the Logger Line podcast, Ben DuBose. You can track down on Twitter at Ben DuBose. Ben, the Rockets starting off the season 2-2, a little bit, the record not quite where we thought it would be through 4 games at this point, as we get a nice little cameo appearance behind you. Which dog is that behind you right now?
That's Truman.
Okay, good.
Wow.
We're going to rename this to the Truman Show. There we go. Whenever Truman makes an appearance, it's the Truman Show now.
He's got the Rockets harness on, so there you go.
Hey, I love it. I love the cameo appearance. Look, Rockets 2-2 at this point, and there have been some positive, good development so far this season, namely Jalen Green playing like a legit star. We're going to talk about him a little bit later in the episode, but there's also been some concerns through 4 games. And one of them that I want to address here from the jump, let's talk a little bit about Alperen Sengun, right? Mm-hmm. This has been a less than encouraging start to the season for Alperen Sengun. Now, I'm not ready to sound the alarm bells yet. I'm not ready to completely panic or overreact to a 4-game sample size. But at the same time, it is a little concerning, right? You pay the guy a nice, 5-year, slightly below max deal, and you expect him to come in, a guy who was clearly the team's best player last season, and he just really hasn't lived up to that expectation so far through 4 games. Now, some of that might be matchups, some of that might be maybe he's got an injury. We really don't know yet at this point.
Yeah, and I think there's a few myths to it. First off, let's acknowledge what I think is just silly on social media, this idea that, oh, he got the contract, so he's not incentivized. No, we talked about during the opener, he is in phenomenal shape. He took his body seriously this offseason, so this is not a guy who needs to work his way back into physical form. I think there's some indecision going on, and I think some of the changes structurally to the team, the offense, the defense, and so on and so forth could be playing a role. But physically, he's in better shape than ever. He's definitely competing very hard. I think Saturday, he got a little bit timid. Monday against the Spurs, he looked significantly better, in my opinion. Didn't shoot efficiently, but he competed. And I think some of the issues down the stretch of that game are just related to him having 5 fouls and thus unable to defend at the level that he would want to without risking him, A, being disqualified from the game, and B, sending the Spurs to the line since they were over the limit. I think a lot of what's going on with LP, it's tough for him to find the balance with the way he played last year, with the way Ime Udoka wants to play at a faster pace. And one of the myths that I think is out there on social media, when you bring up the topic of LP and pace, and Ime Udoka did this himself, this is not just private conversations. Ime said it in one of the post-game press conferences after either Charlotte or San Antonio, I forget which one. Some of the folks I've seen on social media will push back and say, well, hold on. The Rockets are actually in the bottom 10 in the league in pace right now. So this isn't a factor. I don't think what Ime is saying is that LP is incapable of running the floor the way they want to. No, he's not saying that. What I think he's getting at with the pace is that they want players on the court to make quicker decisions, all 5 guys. And they may not be doing it every trip down, but that's what they are trying to do. And that emphasis is very different than it was last year, or for most of last year, when until the All-Star break, when LP was the leading option, it was much more of a half-court style with Fred and LP running the show and Jaylen in a secondary role. And I think what's happened here, you combine the changes to the offense with how hot Jaylen has been to start this season, and I think LP is a little reluctant to get in the way. And so if he's going up against a guy like Wemby, who's 7'3" and makes it to where basically no shot is a given, because with Wemby's wingspan, he can almost always contest, then I think we've seen LP get a little bit deferential in these last two games. And so I think this is him sort of feeling his way out, both in terms of playing alongside a version of Jaylen that he's never played with before, and a new system that, keep in mind, he only played for 2.5 weeks, out of the All-Star break last year before that ankle injury. So I think he's still adjusting to the system, the scheme that Ime wants to play. I think he's adjusting to this version of Jaylen for the first time. And I think it's just made him a little tentative, a little indecisive, a little passive. And I think the cure to that is for him to, build his confidence, get some easier shots, get back in rhythm. It's just difficult to do that when you're facing a 7'3" guy with a wingspan that feels like it's 8 feet.
Yeah, I definitely want to, it definitely feels like some of it was the matchup with Wemby in particular, right? It's really tough. Okay, 4-game sample size, 2 of them coming against Victor Wembanyama. He's a guy that completely alters the defensive landscape, against any team that he's playing against. Part of it too, and you talk about the indecision part of it, I do think that some of it, because we even saw stretches, right, where Alp didn't look like himself even when Wemby wasn't on the floor. And I think some of that is coming from, right, he does have to, the pace angle is really important, and I'm glad you brought that up. The decision-making does have to be a little bit quicker. In particular, it feels like one of the things that needs to be worked on, right, is Alp's ability to recognize when the double team is coming.
Yes.
Right? When he's got the ball down low, there have been a lot of opportunities so far in this 4-game sample size of this season where he's not quickly recognizing, okay, the double is being sent. Now I kick it back out. Who's my outlet pass? Who am I swinging the ball to? Where's my safety valve, right? Or my release valve? And that's led to some mucky offense, right? That's led to some turnovers. That's led to him putting up some ill-advised shot attempts. And that could easily be better. And it might not directly lead to Alperen Sengun scoring the ball more or looking like he's got a higher usage or looking like himself last season. But at least the Rockets as a collective unit, the team would look better. The system, the process would look a lot better in some of those moments.
Yeah, and I think some people will rightfully point out, look, he put up 45 and 16 when we last saw him go against Wemby in March. Well, a couple of things have changed. First, Wemby is a better player. I do believe that he improved from that Olympic experience with Team France this offseason. And secondly, Alp was clearly the guy then. I think now, it's not that he's not the guy, but Jaylen is taking a leap into that level as well. And Alp is someone who, above all else, he wants to win. So if they have a chance to win these games, and other than that Saturday game in San Antonio, the Rockets have played from in front in 3 of the 4 games for the most part, then he's going to be deferential. He's not going to want to take away from what's working for the sake of his own personal vanity, for the sake of his stats. And so I think if early on in the game, other guys have it going, then that makes it a little bit less likely for Alp to want to be as aggressive as he was in that early March meeting when he really took it to Wemby. And so I think, the cure to this is to build up his confidence a little bit, get him in rhythm, get him some easier shots, some easier reads. It's tougher to do that against Wemby, and the sample in terms of those minutes you're speaking to without Wemby, it's just so small, and it's later in the game once other guys have been established that I think it's tough to take too much from.
Coming up, want to get into one more angle from this Alperen Sengun discussion, as well as some of the other concerns for the Rockets through the early part of the season, the rebounding in particular, where they've gotten beat on the glass, and that's led to some inconsistent play through these first 4 games, as well as we'll talk about Jaylen Green a little bit later in the episode. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Look, Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play live even easier, but that's not the only feature that they have that's incredible. They've got their Game Time ticket coverage, their lowest price guarantee, views from your seat, so you know exactly what to expect when you get to your venue. My personal favorite is their all-in pricing feature. When you download the Game Time app, you toggle on the all-in pricing feature, and it shows you the price from start to finish. They are fully transparent throughout the entire ticket buying process. So take the guesswork out of buying your tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Now, Ben, one thing about this Alperen Sengun discussion, I'm curious to see how Ime kind of handles this. Maybe Ime's not worried about it. Maybe he's just like, all right, Alpi will be fine, not going to overreact to the first 4 games. But I would be curious because we've seen Ime still kind of tinkering with his rotations, trying to figure out where certain guys are going to be, his substitution patterns, right? And we know that obviously like Thompson, Tari, Eason are big pieces off the bench, but we've seen different lineups, right? We've seen Jalen Green come out of the game early. We've seen Jalen Green stay in the game with the starters. We've seen Fred VanVleet running the second. We've seen different things through these first 4 games. I wonder if there's a version of this team where maybe Alp doesn't, I don't want to say gets the early substitution, but essentially a lineup that is more Alperen Sengun focused, right? We hear Ryan Hollins talking about it on the broadcast a lot. Hey, this is the lineup where Alp can get to work, right? This is the lineup where put the ball down to Alp, let him go to work in the post. Maybe there's a way to, I'm not saying that Alperen Sengun can't succeed and thrive in this new look Rocket system and offense with the faster pace, the quicker decisions. I think he absolutely can. It's an adjustment period though. But can he maybe play some of the way that he's used to, right? The slower decision making, the slower half court play in certain lineups for small stretches of the game to maybe get himself going, right? Get himself in rhythm.
Yeah, to go back to what we were saying earlier about building confidence. And it might be more possible than you think because Steven Adams coming off that injury is limited, it looks like, to 4 or 5 minute bursts. They don't really want him to be out there for, 8-10 minutes at a time. It doesn't feel like. So if you're keeping Steven to shorter bursts, then maybe you can bring him in earlier in the first quarter or later in the first quarter. But the idea is probably to pair Steven with Jaylen so that you can have the benefit of those screens. We saw Jaylen take advantage of that immediately in that San Antonio game. And then we know Ime wants to sort of stagger Jaylen and Fred to where at least one of those is out there for all 48 minutes or as long as the game is competitive. And so that way, the minutes that Jaylen is sitting for Fred, then you can have Fred run the offense with LP. And it's something similar to those first 40 to 60 games of last year before Sengun was lost with the ankle injury. And I think, again, it's not to say that Sengun has to be used that way. I'm with you in that you can get him up to speed with the offense that Ime wants to run with the starters and with the closing lineups. But I do think that now step one is just restoring that confidence, getting him in the right headspace so that he can take advantage of all the normal gifts. And so I think in the short term, mirroring his minutes to Fred a little bit more potentially is sort of what will unlock the LP time, if you will, to where he's the clear hub, the clear fulcrum of the minutes. That might be a little bit of a stimulus you can turn to as well.
It's actually another concern that this is something that we discussed a little bit, in private, whatever, but without hitting record. But Fred looks a little different this year, and I think that maybe there's a level to it where last year, right, it was nobody knew what to expect from the Rockets. The Fred VanVleet, Alperen Sengun pick and roll was clearly the Rockets' bread and butter, and it worked really well for a good chunk of the season. But now, like, the secret is out, right? People know how to defend it, and unfortunately, at this stage, Fred doesn't have nearly, it feels like, the downhill pressure to be able to kind of open things up in that 2-man game with Alperen Sengun. We're seeing teams really play Fred as just exclusively a perimeter player. We're seeing them, rush him off the 3-point line, and it doesn't feel like the effectiveness is as good as it was last season. Now, some of that might just be, again, early sample size, 4 games, whatever, different matchups, competition, that kind of thing. But I think there is a little bit of a concerning trend there. We saw it against San Antonio 2 straight games where Jaylen and Cam were the only 2 guys that could really get anything downhill against the Spurs.
Well, and I also think this is a byproduct of Jaylen's development and some other young guys like Amin and Tari emerging onto the scene as well. There are shots last year that you would see guys like Fred and Dylan take that they're not taking this year. And so it's tough for me to say how much is Fred can't do it anymore and how much is he won't do it because he no longer thinks it's as beneficial of a shot to the offense, because now you do have these other guys that are coming on strong. With Jaylen in particular late in games, I've seen Fred pass up looks that I'm pretty sure he would have taken a year ago, but he's not taking now because he doesn't think it's in the team's best interest. I think there's some of that as well. We often talk about Fred being willing to play more off ball as something that can be beneficial to his long-term role in Houston as Jaylen and other perimeter guys potentially get scaled up. Maybe Reed Shepherd, as the months progress, fits into this as well. Well, just because he's willing doesn't mean it's going to be easy. There still is going to be a transition. And just as I mentioned that Alp, I think, is struggling a little bit with the transition to, Jalen's usage being dialed up and relying on him a little bit more, especially in high leverage moments, then it's not easy for Fred as well, because a year ago, it felt like Fred was the guy who late in close games, you almost always gave the keys to in a perimeter sense and said, get us to the finish line. Now, last night, Fred did hit the dagger three to get them the win over San Antonio, but it was Jaylen who made that play. It was Jaylen who was entrusted with the read, and he saw Fred's defender go, and Jaylen said, okay, your defender's coming with me, and the guy covering Jabari isn't rotating over. Let's kick it to Fred. And Fred did what he should do as a veteran shooter and buried the shot. But it was Jaylen who was leaned on to make that play. And so that's sort of the glass half full way to look at it. The glass half empty, as you said, is maybe Fred just doesn't have the juice anymore. It is something you have to worry about a little bit as guys get into their 30s. But I think some of it, at least, is also Fred, as he's transitioning into a little bit lower usage than what we've seen in the past, then maybe there's a little bit of indecision at times from him as well, in which he's thinking, hey, maybe I can take this shot, but maybe I shouldn't take this shot because, now we have Jaylen in near all-star form. Maybe it's better off if we kick it to him, or maybe we want to get Jabari involved because he's showing some signs. I think there's more considerations at play this year with a deeper roster. And so I think the guys who were leaned on heavily last year, Fred and Alp, it's natural that they would be the ones that are sort of caught in moments of indecision because of that.
One of the positives through 4 games is we haven't seen this team put together a full 4 quarters of basketball. Ime's talked about this multiple times. Consistency has very much been a factor through these first 4 games. We've seen them, they put together a really good first half against the Hornets, then bottomed out in the second half, then the inverse of that against the Grizzlies, and then some of the same again against the San Antonio Spurs, where each one of those games, they had 1 or 2 quarters that they just completely disappeared, whether it was the offense drying up and potentially an even larger concern here is this is supposed to be like a good, hard-nosed, physical, gritty, like rebounding defense first team. And for whatever reason, they just completely lose that mentality out of like 12 to 24 minutes out of the game for some reason in these first 4 games. What do you see going on there, Ben?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I had someone on my timeline last night when the Rockets nearly coughed up that lead to the Spurs who said this feels just like last year. And, I gently responded, no, it honestly doesn't. Last year, they played very hard. It just felt like they were fairly raw, which they were in terms of closing out games at a high level, especially against good competition. And so you saw a team whose metrics suggested they should win 45, 46 games, ended up going 41 and 41, in large part because they let some games slip away late. Last night was sort of the inverse of that. Against the Spurs, look, the Rockets executed in the clutch. They won the final 8 minutes, 18-15, and that's with 8 of the Spurs' 15 points coming on that bizarre 6-point play, which was totally freakish, and then the cosmetic Wemby dunk as time expired that was meaningless. For the most part, on both ends of the court, the Rockets went out and executed when it mattered. What made that game close and what turned a 20-point deficit into, or a 20-point lead into just a 2-point lead, was the Rockets getting out-rebounded 30-19 in the second half after winning the rebounding battle by 4 in the first half. And so there's a few reasons that could go into it. I think certainly conditioning is one, even for a deep team. Look, guys are not at peak conditioning just yet. That's pretty commonplace. And it's not that the Rockets are the biggest team to begin with. We've talked about that in the past. So perhaps a team like the Rockets not being up to par yet in terms of conditioning. Not saying that they're below where they should be, but below where they will be by December, January, when all these guys are used to playing in NBA level basketball.
Or even below where they need to be as, again, like a slightly undersized team. We've talked about they are basically undersized at every position except for Jabari in the starting lineup.
Yeah, so I could buy that hurts them a little bit. But I also think, to your point on the starting lineup, look, when we think of the Rockets as a really good rebounding team, sure, Sengun and Jabari are good rebounders for their positions, but you also have guys off the bench like Amen Thompson, Tari, Eason, Steven Adams that can come in and rebound at a very high level, and Amen and Tari potentially playing at, some of the wing positions. Well, for various reasons, Steven's only played 1 game and he's minutes limited. Tari, even though there's not officially a minutes limit, it's pretty clear they're trying to cap him at about 20 minutes per game now until he proves he can handle it over a little bit longer sample. And with the men, I'm not going to say he's had a bad year. He's certainly been impactful, but offensively, he's still trying to feel his way. And so what that's led to is in these close games, when a man is trying to feel his way, how can he make an impact offensively when the shot, he's had a couple of threes here or there, but by and large, he doesn't help you spacing wise. it feels like Ime doesn't fully trust the half-court offense with a min in it just yet. So in these high-leverage possessions in the fourth quarter, you're seeing the Rockets turn to these lineups with Fred and Dillon, which are going to be, because they're undersized, especially Fred, a little bit weak on the rebounding side. And so I think, you look at that Hornets opener, you look at that second Spurs game, and it was really the second half where the rebounding went south for the Rockets. And I think that's sort of the perfect confluence of a lot of those factors. It's, if conditioning is an issue, then as the game moves along, maybe you don't have the juice in the second half that you do in the first. That could be part of it. But I also think that, if you're running out of minutes to play someone like Tari or Steven, and if, because of the close and late factor in the fourth quarter of a tight game makes you a little more reluctant to play a min, then you don't have the size, the wave of bodies that you do in the first half. And so I think that potentially plays into why we're seeing the Rockets get a little bit worse. Now, the glass half full way to frame all of this, it's a frustrating problem, but it's one that in theory is quite fixable. And if they do, then the Rockets are doing the things offensively led by Jalen Green, who I know we'll get to before we close out the pod, that can make them achieve a level that they weren't able to get to a year ago. So in theory, this is a fixable problem. It's just, they've got to actually do it at some point. That's what's holding them back. The flashes are there offensively. It's just, unless Jalen and LP are both clicking at the same time, the Rockets don't have a good enough offense to solely win games that way. They've got to win games combining that offense with the defense that we're used to, with the effort, with the little things. They've done it in flashes, but they haven't done it for 48 minutes. And that's why a team that could be 3-1 or 4-0 is 2-2.
Fixable problems are the best problems to have in the NBA landscape, and this is very much a fixable problem, one that I'm sure that Ime Udoka and the coaching staff are digging into tirelessly, trying to make sure that they can get ironed out before they have any more, 12-minute, 10-minute quarter collapses, whatever, due to rebounding effort, consistency, things that are very much within the control of this ball club. Coming up, could this be Jaylen Green's all-star season? Could he be the first all-star of the Houston Rockets rebuild? We're going to get there in just one moment. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, Ben, probably the most encouraging thing so far of this Houston Rockets season, one of the biggest questions coming into the season was what version of Jalen Green were the Rockets getting, right? We saw the incredible streak that he had in the month of March to close out last season. Realistically, his play post All-Star break last year was a lot better than it was for the first half or 2/3 of last season. And he's hit the ground running. And so far this year, things have looked really good. Now, some of that you could potentially point to just, okay, he's had some hot shooting games, but it also feels like the process is just inherently better, right? This isn't the Jalen Green that we saw at the beginning of last season that was indecisive, that wasn't sure when to attack or how to do certain things. This looks like a more mature, confident, a Jalen Green that is able to impose his will on a basketball game, can get the Rockets timely buckets when they need it, can steer the offense, has been able to step up to the plate as the lead ball handler in some of these early games. All the signs are pointing to Jalen Green having a breakout year so far through 4 games.
Yeah, and the quote from Ime Udoka post-game in San Antonio where, again, they did execute down the stretch. They gave up that lead, but they took care of business, got good shots when they needed to. Jalen hit a 3, Jabari hit a 3, Fred hit the dagger. And Jonathan Fagan postgame asked about Jalen combining both aggressiveness and patience. And Ime said he's been phenomenal all year as far as that. I think he really grew towards the end of last year. Now it looks like he's getting whatever he wants, whether it's for himself or others. Some of those he used to miss at times and kind of rush into a crowd, over penetrate. He's now making the right reads. And that's what stood out to me as well. Maybe he's not going to shoot 41% on threes all year. I'll believe that when I see it. But I think the process is so much better. And that final play against the Spurs really spoke to it. I think so often last year, it felt like Jalen predetermined in these big moments, especially what he was going to do in terms of, is he going to shoot? Is he going to pass? What direction is he going to go? Whereas the last couple of games, he's done a much better job of taking what's there and reading the defense. Saturday, the help didn't come, so Jalen made plays one-on-one going to the rim. On Monday, it did come, so he kicked it to other guys and let them hit the big shots. And it's going to vary from one game to the next. One thing I'm fascinated to see when the Rockets play better teams in their next 3, going up against Dallas, Golden State, New York, how much are these teams going to focus on the scouting report from last year, which is that Alperen Sengun is clearly the best player, versus how much are they going to look at the scouting report now and say, hey, it may be 4 games, but in this season, Jaylen Green scoring nearly 30 points per game on better than 58% true shooting, better than 40% from three. He's undisputably been the best player. Does that make them more likely to try and take Jaylen out of the game? In which case, okay, initiate your offense through Sengun because he's going to get more one-on-one opportunities. I don't know. The key, if you're Jaylen Green, is to acknowledge that you don't know and read the game and feel it out. It felt like so often last year, the game I go back to, it's funny, they're about to play the Knicks again, but that last time the Knicks came to Toyota Center, which was the Aaron Holiday foul on a 3 by Jalen Brunson, which the NBA, apologized for after, but Rockets got the benefit of the call for once. Before that ball got out to Aaron Holiday for that controversial heave that he was fouled on, Jalen had the ball. They cleared out. It was a tie game in the closing seconds, and he got his bleep stuffed by Mitchell Robinson. You remember that drive? And it felt like everybody in the gym felt they knew exactly when and where he was going to go, and he predetermined that outcome. What you're seeing better this year, especially in the high leverage spots, he's not doing that. And so to me, that's the key. It feels like the process is a lot better. Even if the shooting dips a little bit, he doesn't shoot above 40% from 3. If the process is a lot better, and it's not just us saying this anecdotally, you can also look at the stats. Last year, the really alarming thing, he went from 6.5 free throws per game in his second season to about 4 last year. We talked about him not driving as much. This year, it's back up to 6, even with the games being called a little bit looser, at least in certain stretches, it feels like. So Jaylen, it just feels like everything about this is much more sustainable. Maybe he's not going to shoot 41% on threes, but I don't think he's going to fade back to the, irrelevant guy that he was for long stretches of last season.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, this kind of ties back into our conversation about Alperen Sengun, and you bring up a really great point there, right, about how some of the more elite teams in the NBA are going to guard the Rockets. A lot of the NBA is, knowledge, it's scouting reports, it's homework, it's coming in with a game plan on how you're going to stop XYZ team or XYZ player, and Alperen Sengun was very much at numbers spots 1, 2, and 3 on last year's scouting report, where it got to the point where near the end of the season before Alperen Sengun's injury, it was like, okay, if you shut down Alperen Sengun, then that's all the Rockets have. They don't have anything else other than, a poor, Fred VanVleet or Jalen Green isolation possession, because he was everything for the Houston Rockets offense last year. This year, that's not the case, right? So how are teams going to guard Jalen? And then on top of that, how's Alperen Sengun going to respond, right? Like if the Knicks come in, if the Mavericks come in and they say, okay, we're going to shut down Jalen Green, we're going to trap him, we're going to blitz him in pick and rolls, can Alperen Sengun then rise to the occasion and play like his previous self, like the last year's version of himself? And once we see those two guys playing their best versions of basketball with one another in tandem, which I fully believe that they can. Again, there's still that weird, like, rumor or conspiracy theory out there that Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun can't coexist on the basketball floor. And that is one of, I think, the worst takes or anything. Those two guys have games that are so complementary with one another. We just haven't seen them both have and we've actually seen them both have dominant games together. We just haven't seen it consistently, right? You could point to the Lakers game from last season where they both went 30 plus. That game was unbelievable. They dominated together.
And it might be a situation where the tougher schedule brings out the best of them because, look, if you're looking underneath the hood, there's a lot to like here. It's not just Jalen Green. The Rockets right now, even though they're 2-2, they are a top 10 team on defense, ranked 7th in the league, and they're a top 10 team on offense, 9th in the league. So there's something to work with here. Even though they're not at their best, all P specifically, then the fact that they are already this good shows you that, they can get to a higher level once he gets going. And so I think when you see the schedule stiffen, what's going to be interesting, I feel like these first 4 games, they've gone in favored in each of them. And so when the going gets tough, I think that makes it more likely for, I'll use All P as an example, but I think some of it applies to Fred as well, for those guys to be deferential. If Jalen has it going on, they don't want to deviate too much from the game plan because they say, you know what? We've just got to get this game by any means necessary, and we have a margin for error. So if Jalen has it going on, let's feed him. I'll worry about me another day. As opposed to when you're going up against a team like Dallas in specific, but maybe the Knicks go into this as well, with a lot of high-level players. Let's use Dallas because they're next on the schedule, and so they've got Luka and Kyrie. you know they're going to put up points. And so, going in, it is going to be very unlikely on the road that Jaylen Green alone is going to get you over the finish line to get a win. You need two top shelf playmakers in close to, A-level form to win that game. So maybe that forces the Rockets, both at a coaching level and also just the players on the court, to think a little bit bigger picture and say, hey, we're not going to be able to win this game without Alperen Sengun getting going the way we know he can at an all-star or near all-star level. So rather than say, hey, we'll worry about another day, maybe the better competition sort of forces the Rockets to deal with these structural issues, because they know that, to beat a team like Dallas on the road, they don't have a choice. The formula just is not there if you don't get a close to all-star Alperen Sengun in all likelihood. So maybe the better opponents sort of forces them to deal with these underlying issues in a way that when they're playing teams like the Hornets, the Spurs, that they feel like they should beat, they can say, you know what, let's just ride the hot hand, do what we got to do to get the win and worry about the rest later. Well, you can't necessarily do that in Dallas, so maybe the schedule gives them a little bit of a bump just because it forces them to sort of examine some of these underlying issues. So too could having 2 days off before that game, and maybe the rebounding and the rest factors can finally work their way for a change.
It's kind of it's like that old adage, right? Playing down to the level of your opponent at times, which, you have more of a margin for error. So maybe it's not exactly playing down to the level of your opponent, but not necessarily, right? There's just a lot more pressure when you're going up against,
and you're not challenged.
The former Western Conference champion, right? You're going to have to bring out your best if you want to beat the Mavericks this upcoming Thursday. So hopefully that's something that kind of ignites, Alperen Sengun, gets him back playing to form. We get the, continued version of Jaylen Green here. Now, one thing that I want to bring up before we round out this pod, Jaylen Green's had a fantastic start to the season. We're going to see what he looks like playing against some upper echelon competition over these next few games with Dallas, New York, Golden State, all that. Assuming he keeps this production up, I'm already annoyed in anticipation for the fact that I don't know if Jaylen Green, I don't know what the numbers would need to be for him to make an all-star team, because I feel like it's going to be similar to Alperen Sengun last year, where the West is just so ridiculously deep with talent, where what numbers would Jaylen Green have to basically make him an undeniable all-star pick at this point is where I'm getting at, because he might be having a phenomenal season. He could be having the best season of his career, and he might not actually get that all-star nod, that all-star honor. Very similar to Alperen Sengun, 21-9-5 last season, didn't actually become an all-star, even though he very much had all-star level production. And I would hate to see that happen this year for Jaylen Green.
Yeah, I mean, I think 25 points a game on reasonable efficiency gets him into the conversation. If he's in the upper 20s, the way he is now at almost 29, I think it would be a lock, but that's probably a lot to expect. If he's in the mid 20s, it's reasonable. And then from there, I think it just comes down to how the Rockets are faring as a team, similar to Sengun a year ago. If the All-Star voting had been done in early January, when the Rockets were firmly inside the play-in field and at times even as high as 5 or 6 in the West, then I think there would have been a push to reward the Rockets and say, hey, this team is clearly overachieving expectations. They've got something here. We should reward the best player on that team. I think there was a little bit of push for that in late December, early January, but by the time that the voting actually took place in terms of, not just the fan voting, which LP ranked very highly on, but the players, the media, the coaches, all that stuff, the Rockets had slipped to, a much lower spot in the standings. They had that road trip where I think they went 1-5 in January. And so they were middle of the pack, something of an afterthought. If the Rockets can win games, and to this point, 2-2, but you like them to be 3-1, 4-0, they can be mentioned top 10, both offensively and defensively at this point. If this is a team that's clearly in, the top 6, top 7, top 8 of a strong Western Conference, then there's going to be a push to reward the best player. And so I think Jaylen being at 25 gets him into the conversation. And then from there, it's going to come down to just how much the Rockets are winning as a team. If the Rockets are a top 6 team, especially to where they'd be in the playoffs, then I think there's going to be a pretty strong push to put whoever their best player is on the All-Star team. And to this point, that best player has been Jaylen Green.
Having some matchups where he's able to embarrass Luka Doncic would also go a very long way in his because it will. You look up and down the All-Star roster from the West last year. The guard competition: Luka, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Devin Booker, Steph Curry, and Anthony Edwards. That is some steep competition for him to maybe supplant. I don't think supplant one of those guys, but maybe get the nod in place of one of maybe the other forwards on the team. Paul George now in the Eastern Conference, Kawhi Leonard hurt, Karl Anthony Towns now in the the other conference, so that does open up some extra spots on the team. But ultimately, what will it look like? Will Jaylen Green be able to earn the Rockets' first all-star bid of the rebuild? Will the Rockets be able to iron out their consistency issues? We're going to see all that stuff moving forward. Ben, you know the drill. Let everybody know where to track you down at.
Yep. Ben DuBose on Twitter/X, the Logger Line, and the Rockets Wire on the same, and rocketswire.usatoday.com for all your daily Houston Rockets news coverage.
That's going to do it for another edition of Locked on Rockets. As always, thank you so much for checking out the show. Remember, the best way you can help us grow the show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing. Like and subscribe on YouTube. And while you're there, drop us a comment. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked on Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.